Behalf of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, especially Lars de Geer, for their work in coordinating today's hearing. This is the second in a series of hearings looking at human rights issues affecting the world's indigenous peoples. The first hearing held last year looked at the situation of indigenous peoples in Latin America. Another hearing looked into the rights of indigenous peoples more globally as governments and corporations lay claim to and exploit resources on their ancestral territories, with case studies on oil, mining, and timber extraction. Today we are turning our attention to Africa, and I'm sure some of you are asking, aren't all the people of Africa indigenous to Africa? Our focus today is on indigenous peoples, communities, and tribal nations of Africa who, among other characteristics, have a distinct identity, culture, and language, have continuity with and have occupied ancestral lands, or at least part of them, have common ancestry with the original occupants of these lands, and are determined to preserve, develop, and transmit to future generations their ancestral territories and distinct cultural and social identity as the very basis for their existence as a people. We in Congress know some of their names. We know the Batwa and the Bakwa forest peoples of Uganda, Rwanda, and DRC, and their cousins in Cameroon and the CAR. We know the terrible genocide of Rwanda between the Hutu and the Tutsi nearly decimated the already fragile existence of the all-forgotten Twa people. We know about the Maasai of Kenya and Tanzania, the San of South Africa and Botswana, the Agoni of Nigeria, and the Tuareg of Algeria. But the majority of these indigenous peoples are not so well known. They are often minorities in societies dominated by other ethnic, racial, or tribal groups. In their commitment to maintain their unique cultural identity and social institutions, they are often marginalized and face discrimination, human rights abuses, and even violence. Dominant forms of economic development and farming often undermine their traditional livelihoods, steal or push them off their ancestral lands, or steadily erode their ability to survive in the forest or across the plains or in the mountains and deserts or even more remote regions. Taken as a whole, they are most likely to be poor, disenfranchised, and lacking the protection of basic rights and services. Only a few African states recognize and protect the basic collective rights of indigenous peoples in their constitutions or national legislation. Indigenous peoples suffer from weak political representation and from discrimination and negative stereotyping from mainstream society. Indigenous women, in many cases, face particular problems as both belonging to marginalized groups and being subjected to culturally based forms of discrimination as women. These include access to leadership positions, decision-making power, issues of land rights, rights and access to education, violence against women, and forced marriage, including child marriage. I have found, however, that when indigenous peoples have the opportunity to organize and speak and act on their own behalf, they are a powerful force in determining their own future and their own destiny. As stewards of their land and as the living depository of knowledge accumulated over millennia, indigenous peoples can play and are undertaking unique roles in combating climate change, preserving biodiversity, and in boosting agricultural productivity in a sustainable way. So I look forward to the hearings today, the hearing today, and listening to the views of our witnesses on these and other matters. Our first panel, I'm very proud to have Sharon Cromer. She is the Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for Sub-Saharan Africa at USAID, a position that she has held for almost 1 year now. With respect to Africa, she has served in many capacities and has, among other things, been the USAID Mission Director in Ghana and Nigeria. She has an incredible resume and incredible knowledge, and I'm proud that you're here and look forward to hearing your testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's both an honor and a privilege to present this testimony to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. I'm grateful for this occasion to describe to you how the U.S. government, and specifically USAID, is helping indigenous peoples in Africa as they look ahead to a rapidly changing set of challenges and opportunities. Late last year, following a period of intensive review within U.S. government agencies, President Obama announced that the United States would endorse the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Clearly, the President wanted our efforts to reflect American values regarding human rights both at home and abroad. The Declaration contains guidance on how Indigenous peoples want to be treated within the boundaries of their traditional home areas. I'm proud to say that USAID is responding to the particular needs of Indigenous peoples in Africa, and through our initiatives and programs, we're giving meaning to our nation's endorsement of that declaration. My testimony today will touch very briefly on 7 key points. My first point is that over the past 50 years, USAID has earned a well-deserved reputation for reaching out to Indigenous peoples as partners in Africa's development. The people we describe as indigenous are many, and they're widely spread across Africa. From the Equateur province of the Democratic Republic of Congo to the Godere forest of the Manjagir people of Ethiopia, from Mali's central plateau and the Mopti region, where the Dogon people live, to the arid Namibian landscape, USAID is there and has been. We partner with the Nilotic pastoralists in the Karamoja region of Uganda, and with small and vulnerable communities deep in the rainforests of the Congo River Basin. We've put into place community-centered approaches for biodiversity conservation in a wide zone across the Upper Guinean forest ecosystem in West Africa. We are active with mobile pastoralist communities in an area known as the Pastoral Arc of the Horn of Africa, stretching across Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somalia. Few other institutions have such a geographic reach and such wealth of experience in working with Indigenous people. This distinguishes USAID. The second point is that no one wants progress for Indigenous peoples to come at the expense of damaging their environments or undermining their cultures. Globalization has driven development faster and farther than ever before, and unless properly managed, the ecosystems of tropical forests, coastal regions, mountains and highlands, and semi-arid rangelands stand in jeopardy. All of these areas have become increasingly vulnerable to destructive forms of exploitation and to the forces of climate change. The global demand for natural resources is unrelenting, and the threat extends to the integrity and health of the cultural and social structures that define each Indigenous person and his or her community. At USAID, we've committed ourselves to work closely with Indigenous peoples across Africa to generate development strategies and practices that are sensitive to threatened cultures, unique languages, and valuable natural resources. Our development strategies and the programs that spring from them reflect our concentration on respecting nature, generating wealth, and fostering good governance. The goal is straightforward. We are determined to achieve measurable improvements in the quality of life for Indigenous peoples and to include them in social and political institutions in ways that make sure that they're also benefiting from any substantial economic growth in their areas. The third point is that we at USAID understand the importance of developing a partnership with Indigenous peoples. We demonstrate our commitment to the interests of Indigenous peoples in Africa by calling attention to all relevant human and legal rights that such peoples ought to have access to, by respecting their cultures, and by understanding their complex natural environments. In some cases, USAID's primary role is to help to establish carefully crafted and sustainable environmental safeguards. At other times, Indigenous peoples look to the leverage that we at USAID can provide through our voice in national, regional, and global policy forums. USAID also exercises our responsibility within Title 13 of the International Financial Institutions Act to review multilateral assistance programs and address any potential adverse impacts on Indigenous peoples. The fourth point is the need to reconcile American values with traditional African cultures. We want to help Indigenous peoples to keep what's best about their own cultures. However, as with USAID programming globally, our work with Indigenous peoples includes an emphasis on issues of gender equality and human rights. We're also working to build the capacity of Indigenous peoples and their organizations to open up a path towards sustainable livelihoods, even within sensitive ecosystems. To get there, we know we'll need to draw upon their own understanding of their ecosystems and demonstrate to them that we're serious about offering our assistance as they try to conserve these unique resources. The fifth point is that there is a delicate global balance. USAID is aware that the development pressures on the lands and resources of Indigenous peoples have potentially negative consequences that affect whole countries, regions, and even the health of the planet. Tropical forests, coastal zones, and semi-arid lands all form part of a delicately balanced global ecosystem that demands our understanding, protection, conservation, and respect. The sixth point is that the fact that the guidance that shapes USAID's approach to Indigenous people and Indigenous issues is seen in a variety of approaches in line with State Department policies. As we move from policy to action, we're careful to be governed by our experienced ambassadors and USAID mission directors in the field. Priorities under these policies include developing sustainable economic uses of biological resources, building local capacity for the management of biodiversity, supporting innovative conservation and research programs, encouraging Indigenous peoples and local communities to have a strong voice at every stage of decision-making, and lending our weight in setting conservation priorities that respect the rights of Indigenous people at the local, national, and regional levels. Indigenous peoples depend on natural resources, but too often they are marginalized in terms of their decision-making power over these resources. USAID has worked for decades to redress that situation through our decentralized and participatory approaches, such as our community-based natural resources management programs all over the continent. We're now working closely with our colleagues at the Millennium Challenge Corporation and the State Department to develop a U.S. government policy on environmentally friendly and ethically sound ways to frame our development activities when it comes to land management, all the while respecting the priorities of Indigenous peoples. At USAID, we insist upon strong environmental safeguards and state-of-the-art monitoring and evaluation practices so that we know if we're getting the results that our investments are aiming for. We're aware that important new initiatives such as Feed the Future and USAID's investment in supporting the international and national efforts in reduction in emissions from deforestation and forest degradation will mean shifts in land and natural resource use, access, ownership, and control, making the need for a renewed commitment to environmental safeguards even more necessary. My final point is that there is good reason for optimism. USAID recognizes, celebrates, and supports promising new initiatives that have been generated by Africans for the welfare and benefit of African indigenous peoples. For example, the new Kenyan Constitution obligates the state to provide for adequate representation of marginalized groups in all levels of government, to exercise affirmative action on behalf of these groups, and to promote the use of indigenous languages and the free expression of traditional cultures. The Democratic Republic of Congo also recently passed legislation recognizing the rights of indigenous peoples, including their rights to participate in decisions affecting them according to their own decision-making processes, and their rights to communal land as adjudicated under customary law. We know, however, that more needs to be done. We need better research to better understand the character of the threats and opportunities faced. We've got to reach for policy consensus among multiple stakeholders to be sure that we protect the rights, respect the cultural inheritance, and incorporate the perspectives, knowledge, and preferences of indigenous peoples into our combined development agendas. We also know that we must continue to work with our international partners and African governments to mitigate the serious incidences of violence arising out of widespread conflicts in many regions in which indigenous peoples live, so that a clear path to sustainable peace can be realized. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission. I'm happy to take questions.
Well, thank you very much for your excellent testimony, and we appreciate this administration's commitment to protecting the rights of indigenous peoples. I had mentioned before that we had a hearing on indigenous peoples in Latin America, and one of the sad realities of the situation is that by the time, in many cases, voices are raised to protect the rights of indigenous communities, they're already destroyed. And that's one of the things that obviously we are very much concerned about. Let me begin with a question. There was a recent article in The Economist which talked about the surge in land deals, especially in Africa. And the article furthermore questions the benefits of large land acquisition by investors and highlights the pernicious influence of corruption on these transactions. The World Bank has suggested a mechanism modeled after the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative to increase transparency with respect to such land acquisitions. But I'm curious what we think about that. I mean, I was at a briefing this morning with Lester Brown, and he was also talking about this kind of surge in land acquisitions and the implications it has not only on indigenous communities but on countries' ability to grow food and have access to water. So I'd like your thoughts on that, and what methods is the United States pursuing to improve the agricultural productivity of small-scale farmers, and what is being done to ensure that they're not evicted from their lands when these land deals are made.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over the past 2 years, large-scale land acquisitions by private sector investors and sovereign wealth funds have been widely criticized, as you state. Problems cited include opaque and non-participatory negotiations to lease and sell land, and the prevalence of contracts that provide only limited employment opportunities for local people. Some criticism is fair, but problems should not be viewed as universal. Investment is essential to accomplish the goals of improved security and agricultural productivity. And indigenous people may, with appropriate protections of their land tenure and property rights, benefit from large-scale transactions that result from transparent, participatory negotiations and that lead to arrangements or partnerships that provide meaningful benefits to local communities. Creating a system of record that recognizes and enforces the rights of individual groups and legal entities to land and natural resources is critically important in order to empower the rights of holders and protect against unlawful evictions, resettlements, and uncompensated takings of property. At the same time, creating robust land governance systems will help encourage domestic and foreign direct investment that will help spur increases in agricultural productivity, and that will help meet the important policy goals of the U.S. government's Feed the Future strategy. This also commensurate with our African partners' goals of increasing agricultural productivity. So it's important, Mr. Chairman, to make sure that we are using all measures to ensure the participation of indigenous peoples in these governance systems, and we at USAID are committed to that.
Speaking in just in very general terms with regard to Africa, and I know that we're trying to get more representation from indigenous communities at the table when issues are being dealt with. But one of the things that I heard, and maybe I'm wrong on this, is that sometimes it's not there's sometimes substitutes for representation from the indigenous communities, that the participation rate is not as high as we would like, and I say we, I'm using the general we, not the but we're not doing enough to kind of involve them in some of these major decisions, that oftentimes they're substitutes for the indigenous representation that are making some of these decisions. I'm just curious, I mean, if you were to kind of rate, the participation of indigenous communities in Africa in some of these decisions that affect them directly, I mean, are we, is it low, is it medium, is it high? I mean, or how would you characterize that?
We have a number of experts at USAID who could characterize that better than I could. In fact, I have two of them here with me. If you'd like, they could come to the table and answer that question for you.
Sure.
I have Dr. Chloe Swenke. Would you like to come to the table? And Walter Nausenberger.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
Why don't you just press the push button there, yeah.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
Morning.
Chloe Schwenke. This is a challenge that is faced in all of our activities involving African people generally, not just indigenous populations, and that is to make sure that their voices are actually being heard themselves. What happens as an interim stage is that civil society organizations speak on their behalf. That's a reflection of just a sense of comfort to be engaged in that type of dialogue that civil society groups are more conversant with. We are quite careful to, consistently question those civil society groups around the issues of legitimacy. Who are you speaking for? On what authority are you making these statements? Are your assertions justifiable? It's a sort of a due diligence process that we regularly engage in with civil society. We also exert consistent pressure with civil society to develop capacity so that more and more through time, actual representatives of indigenous peoples are there at the table, and that we don't need to have a separate voice representing them. That trend is well advanced across Africa. It's much less well advanced within indigenous populations, largely as a function of education,
Right.
and largely as a function of just unfamiliarity with that type of dialogue process. Our residual concern, of course, is how we get women involved in
Right.
that process as well, because traditional societies, if you go revert to what they would say who represents them, they won't put their women forward. And the women themselves, because they, in many cases, simply have no access to any education in a formal sense, are not very well positioned to speak well on their own behalf.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a lot of work still to do to have that dialogue with traditional leaders to say, we really need to hear from your women, we really want to hear from your women, and we're working with civil society to put that message across as part of the total package of empowerment of local representatives of indigenous populations to be those conversants with us.
And again, I guess a concern is as we develop this process to involve more direct representation and more women representation, while all that's going on, there are these land deals that are happening, there are trade agreements that are being moved forward, there's all kinds of stuff going on that, you know, in some cases, potentially could have a very adverse impact on some of these communities. And so, you know, one of the challenges is how do you protect the rights of these communities? How do you protect their culture, their identity, and so that they don't get, you know, swept up in some of these deals that are being made, and then we're you know, then it's too late, really. I mean, again, I go back to the hearing. I remember going to go back to the hearings we had in terms of Latin America. I remember visiting Ecuador and visiting some of the indigenous communities that really have been kind of essentially decimated because of development deals. I mean, they no longer operate or the way they used to. Their culture has been kind of destroyed, and you know, their whole way of life has. But it just they've been pushed farther and farther in that case into the jungles. But they're just different. They're no longer what they used to be, and it's. So it's just you know, and I don't know what the right answer is. It's just raising the concern that, you know, that in an age where we're all committed to development and expansion and land deals and trade agreements, and that, especially us here in the United States, that we're sensitive to the realities that face these indigenous communities. But you know, and I appreciate. I think you are. I think I'm kind of speaking to the converted here, but it's just something that is troublesome to us, and we're trying to find ways to, you know, help be a voice for these communities, you know, while all this is going on.
Mr. Chairman.
Let me ask, to what extent are we considering indigenous peoples as partners in our efforts to combat climate change?
Yes, sir. My name is Walter Knasenberger, and I spent quite a few years working in East Africa with the mobile pastoralist communities. And there is a community which exhibits all the attributes of indigenous peoples that we have described, who have not been represented at the appropriate fora, have been maligned over the decades as troublemakers, when in fact they have governance systems which are couldn't be part of the solution. They actually managed to move their livestock over large landscapes and have trade routes which are well established over the millennia, and have the ability to adapt to climate change. That's their very nature. Their mobility. So they have over millennia been able to respond to where the rains fall, move their cattle to where the range and are verdant, and where water